Blessed love, and welcome to another edition of Things You Will Ignore in Multicultural Studies. I am your host, Coach Pete. Today's episode is about Phase 5, Everywhere is War. Be sure to pay close attention to our essential question, what role did imperialism play in shaping the modern world? Everywhere is war. War. Ignoring the claims of African ethnic groups, kingdoms, and city-states, Europeans established colonies. Now, why would they do that? Well, there was a mindset in a social theory called social Darwinism that had started to spread in Europe. This was the idea that Europeans considered themselves to be superior as a race. The wealthiest in society were the fittest, and non-Europeans were of a lower nature. Christian missionaries also embodied this principle, believing European rule was the best way to civilize and westernize people of foreign lands. 14 European nations met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 to divide up Africa to prevent conflict among themselves. Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire sent representatives. Point 2. Imperialism in Africa. Europeans embarked on a new phase of empire building that affected both Africa and the rest of the world. Now, when we look at imperialism, there are two major divisions we want to look at. The first is forms of control, and the second are methods of management. With the forms of control, there are four parts. There's the colony, there's the protectorate, there's the sphere of influence, and then there's also economic imperialism. Whereas when we look at the methods of management, we're looking at direct and indirect. Also worthy of note was Menelik II led Ethiopia to the only successful resistance of European colonialism by an African nation. Ethiopia and Liberia were the only African nations not colonized by European countries. Here we have a chart that breaks down the forms of imperialism. Here you can see that a colony, and we can look at the definition, it's a country or territory governed internally by a foreign power, and then we also see examples. The same format is used for the protectorate, for the sphere of influence, and also for economic imperialism. Alright, and here we have the different management methods of imperialism. We have indirect control and direct control. This chart shows us the differences between the two. For example, limited self-rule with indirect control, whereas with direct control, you have no self-rule. With indirect control, the goal is to develop future leaders, whereas with direct control, the goal is assimilation. And there at the bottom, you can see some examples for indirect control. British colonies such as Nigeria, India, and what is now Myanmar, not Burma. And there you have with direct control some examples such as the French colonies of Somaliland and Vietnam, or the Portuguese colonies of Angola. These two maps show us the extent to which Africa was colonized. If you look to the left in 1880, there's still a lot of land that has been quote-unquote unclaimed, or as European activism would say, undiscovered. But as we learned that there were people already there, civilizations already there, societies already there. But by 1913, those societies had been colonized as well. This map gives a clearer breakdown of the different countries, the different nations that had colonized Africa and the regions that they did colonize. So, while Europe is busy dividing up the continent of Africa like shepherd's pie, the United States is focused on affairs closer to home. Point 3. Spanish-American War and U.S. imperialism. All right, if you recall, we read the New Zealand article, Empire Building in the United States and the Caribbean in 1877 to 1920. And when we read the article, we realized that the Spanish-American War of 1898 brought Washington into a new imperial role in the Caribbean. And over the following years, the U.S. government conducted a series of military interventions and completed the massive construction of the Panama Canal. Right? So, businesses and the government were instrumental in shaping life, work, and empire in the region. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at the origins of U.S. imperialism, it's time to move on to our next point. Point 4, World War I. Why does the war break out? Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Because of the alliance system, Germany declares war on Russia and France, and Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. When we think about what type of war occurred, we got to think with World War I, trench warfare. This type of warfare was very tough on soldiers, and it produced a stalemate. Here's a map of Europe in 1914. As you can see the map, you can look at the Allies, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and you also see the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So what's the legacy of the war? First, World War I destroyed many European economies. It also damaged many social and political systems due to the destruction and massive loss of life. Second, World War II revealed the military and industrial potential of the United States. It strengthened the government of the United States, and the United States became a new world power. Last but not least, Germany's economy was crippled, and much anger and resentment grew after World War I. In fact, an Austrian named Adolf Hitler had a desire for vengeance that would plunge the world into an even greater war, which the U.S. would play a prominent role. African American participation during World War I. Well, many African Americans did enlist. They found themselves enlisting into a segregated military that had made no provision for the military training of black officers. Fighting for democracy in Europe, then coming back home to more segregation and brutality. Native Americans played a crucial role. That's right, the indigenous people of America were the first code talkers, and in fact were instrumental in being able to communicate during World War I without the detection of Germany. Point 5, World War II. Now the causes of World War II, if we're looking at the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles really created a whole lot of resentment in Germany, and we end up seeing a rise of fascism in places like Italy. Now Japan wanted to expand. They needed to get more space for their growing population. So they've already moved into places like Korea. Now they want to expand into places like Manchuria and China. There's also this economic depression that led to these other places, these other countries, these other nations. Nationalism is really strong. So you got nations like Japan, in Italy, in Germany. The depression that occurred in the United States made it so that their economies were suffering as well. You also have this anti-communism sentiment that is taking root of the mentality of many people in the United States, along with this idea of appeasement, not really rising up to check the fascism in Italy. There's a growing sense of militarism and nationalism. And last but not least, you see the rise of a figure like Hitler in Germany. Now, Hitler was born in Austria, and he believed in the superiority and the unity of the German peoples. He led the National Socialist Party, aka Nazis, which promoted the belief in a racial superiority of the German Aryan race. He had anti-Semitic views. He was hostile and had hatred and prejudice against the Jewish people. He blamed the Jews for all of Germany's problems. And Hitler believed that Europe needed to purge themselves of all Jews. And we've seen this same type of sentiment that came with European activism when we studied the indigenous people of the Americas. As Hitler took over Europe, he imprisoned millions of Jews. And there we have the term ghetto, which is neighborhoods and cities that Jews were confined to live in. We tend to think of ghetto involving Negroes or African Americans, but this was its origination. Concentration camps, which were prison compounds that imprisoned Jews and political enemies of Nazi Germany, were used. Prisoners received little food and were forced to perform hard labor. Starvation and overwork was designed to kill. Hitler called for the destruction of all the Jewish population of Europe through extermination camps, which takes us back to a familiar term when looking at the indigenous peoples of America: genocide. Another important element of World War II was the American Indian code talkers. Now, they were first introduced during World War I, but the United States military developed a specific policy to recruit and train American Indian speakers to become code talkers to defeat the evils of the fascists in Italy, Mussolini, and in Germany, Hitler. And once again, we have a familiar story. Negroes who served in the military faced enough discrimination, enough segregation, while trying to free other people and spread democracy throughout the world. Now it's evident how imperialism has shaped the global role of the United States. The conflict continues with Point 6, the Korean War. The Korean War has often been called the Forgotten War in the United States, where coverage of the 1950s conflict was censored, and its memories decades later is often overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War. But the 3-year conflict in Korea, which pitted communist and capitalist forces against each other, set the stage for decades of tension among North Korea, South Korea, and the United States. How did it start? Well, the Korean War began when North Korean troops pushed into South Korea on June 25, 1950, and it lasted until 1953. But experts say the military conflict could not be properly understood without considering its historical context. Korea, a Japanese colony from 1910 until 1945, was occupied by the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. The United States proposed temporarily dividing the country along the 38th parallel as a way to maintain its influence on the peninsula, which bordered Russia. The war pitted South Korea and the United States, fighting under the auspices of the United Nations, against North Korea and China. Other nations contributed troops too, but American forces did most of the fighting. The Soviet Union supported North Korea at the beginning of the war, giving it arms, tanks, and strategic advice. But China soon emerged as its most important ally, sending soldiers to fight in Korea as a way to keep the conflict away from its border. The war devastated Korea. Historians said that between 3 million and 4 million people were killed, although firm figures had never been produced, particularly by the North Korean government. As many as 70% of the dead may have been civilians. The fighting stopped when North Korea, China, and the United States reached an armistice in 1953, but South Korea did not agree to the armistice, and no formal peace treaty was ever signed. Neither North or South Korea had achieved its goal, the destruction of the imposing regime and the reunification of the divided peninsula. Since 1953, there have been uneasy coexistence between North and South Korea, which host over 20,000 American troops. So where do we find ourselves in the same old complex story? Indigenous people fighting for what? Africans, Negroes, black people fighting for what? Tribe against tribe, nation against nation, the same old complex story of war within the self, of war itself. Everywhere is war. Yes, I thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of Things You Will Ignore in Multicultural Studies. This has been Phase 5. Everywhere is war.
Love takes us, love keeps us,
Bless and
makes
love.
us.